Once in a while, you'll have a drawer that you won't need to put a drawer face on. And typically, you're going to want it to have a nicer looking joint. And that's what I ran into here. So I decided to make mine using the box spline method. Only problem was I didn't have a proper jig. No, not that kind of jig. This kind of jig. So I set off into the great blue yonder, also known as my scrap pile that I just can't bring myself to throw away. And don't judge me, because I know you have a big pile too. Anyways, after grabbing a few pieces of scrap plywood, I headed over to the table saw. Now, there is no protocol for exactly how wide the jig should be. It kind of depends on the size of the drawer that you plan on running through it. But in this case, I decided to make mine 7 inches wide. So I then grabbed the scrap 3/4 inch plywood and just started ripping them down with no real plan. Just a vision in my head. Next, I decided to make the lower supports. And since a box is supposed to have 90-degree corners, I set the table saw to 45 degrees and then I ran them through. I like to make my angle cuts first before I cut the boards to length because it's easier and I think it's more accurate that way too. I then used the miter saw to trim them down to their final height of 6 inches. After that, I needed to make something for my box to rest on. So I cut an 18-inch long board right down the middle to give me 2 boards 9 inches long with a 45-degree angle on one end. Now I promise this is all going to make sense in just a minute. Once I had those done, I could cut the base plate for the jig. No! Stop that! Good grief. I don't know why that keeps happening. Anyhow, I was going to cut the base plate to 15 inches long, but my scrap piece was 15 3/4 inches long, which was longer than I needed, but I decided to just go with it, and mark the center for a reference line later. Then it was time to test fit all of the pieces I had cut to see how they would fit together, which was kind of more difficult than it should have been. I felt like I needed 2 more arms since I had multiple angles. They kept wanting to go in different directions, and I wanted to check it with a square to make sure my jig was, well, square. I mean, of course I wanted to check for square with a square. It's in the name. Get it together, Michael. But fear not, I realized I didn't have to hold it all together. I could just use some of these nifty corner clamps to keep things where I needed them to be. And it would be square too, so that was an added bonus. Hey, if you're enjoying this video, consider hitting that like and subscribe button, and I read all of the comments, so start your comment off with the word jig, so I know you made it this far in the video. Okay, with that said, next I marked the base plate so I would know where to put the glue during the assembly. But first, I knew the glue up was going to be problematic since I couldn't even keep it together during the test fit, so I made these little clamping calls to help. Now, I thought it would be a good idea to put down some blue painter's tape and then use some glue to hold it in place, like I've seen others do. But honestly, the tape was a mistake. I should have just glued it directly to the wood, and here's why. When you clamp 2 pieces of wood together that have different angles on them, the tape just wants to smear across the wood. Go figure. Thankfully, it didn't mess anything up, but I thought it could benefit someone else to know that. Next, I started squirting some glue, between the lines of course, and used one of these silicone brushes to push it around. I then set the other pieces in place and began to clamp it together, after smearing a little glue on the supports too, of course. Then I could start clamping it together. I also used the square to make sure it was, well, square, while putting on the clamps. I feel like I've said that before. Do you ever get that feeling of deja vu? Anyhow, I also used the square to make sure it was, well, square. I know it looks like a lot of clamps, and it is. But I really wanted to make sure this had good clamping pressure since I was not going to be using any mechanical fasteners. And don't forget to wipe up that glue squeeze out. While that dries, I can cut out the back panel, which may not be completely necessary, but again, I wanted to ensure this device I'm making. You thought I was going to say jig, didn't you? Dope! Whatever. I just wanted the extra rigidity so it won't fall apart when I'm trying to use it on the table saw, okay? There. At this point, I noticed one of my clamps was in the way and I had to take it off. Then I added some more glue, pushed it around, set the panel in place, turned it over, put on one clamp, fixed the panel that fell, put on the second clamp, made a few adjustments, put on the third, the fourth, and finally the fifth clamp. Yes, it's entirely too many clamps for this little project, but what are you going to do? This next part is super important to a successful box spline. You need to use a flat bottom grind blade. And what the HE double hockey sticks is that, you say? Well, let me explain. A flat bottom grind is that flat part of the blade. You'll notice the cutting edge alternates from side to side, and each tip has a flat section on it. This allows the blade to cut an 1/8 inch wide groove that has square corners and, you guessed it, a flat bottom. If you were to use a regular ripping blade, the groove would have a V shape at the bottom, and that won't work for making good box splines. Now, before you start cutting your boxes, I like to run my newly created device through the table saw first, before cutting my drawers. You don't need to cut all the way out the back. You only need to go just past the halfway point. And now you're ready to make the grooves in your boxes. Simply place your box in the jig and slowly push it through. Flip the box, wash, rinse, and repeat for consistent spacing of the grooves. And in an upcoming video, I will show you how I made these mitered kitchen drawers with box splines and why they didn't need a face. Thanks for watching.